Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today I thought we'd go over some stuff which has been going on over the last few days. There seems to have been a modeler who has been either contracted out or, who works directly with Gaijin, who posted a bunch of pictures on their DeviantArt profile of machines which aren't in the game. Now, I was alerted to this last night by Nova Prime, and unfortunately I didn't archive the page because, well, I was going to bed. Then this morning, from sources such as Rocker and Pytor, being told that unfortunately a lot of the models which were taken out, which were not present in the game yet, therefore we didn't actually have the pictures. Now, luckily, the people over on the War Thunder Reddit, Hunter12396, then we've got Kyosaloft, and also Tan007, have been able to create a wonderful list of all of the planes which, are new to the game. Let's say, I shouldn't say new to the game, I should say aren't in the game right now. So the leading theory is this is a company which works with Gaijin to create models for their game. Therefore, what the idea is since there is a decent amount of evidence for this, people believe that the vehicles that were sat on that DeviantArt page will eventually be added to the game. And I think there's at least a strong correlation, between that, and I'll show you why. So first of all, this is the DeviantArt page itself, PSY06, and they have a bunch of models, which they've actually added to either the game or added to previous games. So this is the DB3B and the IO4. These are fully done up models alongside some cockpits as well. So this company has definitely created full blown on models for War Thunder in the past. They've also made cockpits for DCS and also made models for IL-2 Sturmovik Battle of Stalingrad. So this seems to be a company which is heavily involved in the World War II modeling space. You can see here that they also have some other machines such as the Tandem Mai, the T2, the Bf109Z, the Ki 108. All of these are present in War Thunder that you can see here. But as I said today, just a few minutes ago, there were a lot of models, such as this one, which were not present on this page when I personally woke up. So first of all, let's look at kind of, not really a mission statement, but a description of what PSY06 is. If you go to the journal page, it says this: "We specialize in the creation of airframes and its interiors of actually existing flying vehicles for 3D engines, video games, or simulators. Feel free for any such 3D tech project you have. Our studio is capable of performing any task for accurate historical reproduction in 3D. Any tech, plane, ship, car, or something else, we can make in 3D any machine at a 1-to-1 scale, and we perform appropriate historical study for it. We work with original factory plans, manuals, and archived documents. We have made planes since 2006 for the IL-2 series video games, DCS series, and also War Thunder." Now, understand that the broken English is, I believe, because this is a Russian company. And the reason I say that is because if you have a look at machines like the I-225, they actually use the Russian, I shouldn't say markings, but they use the Russian alphabet to talk about it. But they also do that for stuff like the Mitsubishi T2. So I'm not exactly sure where this company is from, but it is definitely shown that they have done work with Gaijin in the past. Probably some subcontract work for them. Probably not, in studio, but instead they've gone, hey, we want this plane produced, or what plane designs do you have, and then we'll pay you for the work that you do. Pretty much as simple as that. So today we're going to go through all of those vehicles that were on this page previously, which unfortunately I wasn't able to save. The first vehicle is the J5N1. Now, what you'll find is a lot of these vehicles are either Japanese or Soviet, and some of them seem a little bit balmy. So I'll make sure to go why I think it's kind of balmy. But for right now, understand that what the J5N1 is it was a prototype heavy fighter, one of these machines which was designed as a twin-engine interceptor to counter the B-29 Super Fortress. It could either mount two 20s or two 30s or a conglomeration of both. So the max firepower that this thing could have is two 20mm and two 30mm, and it also had space to carry a 250-kilo bomb. So the engines on this thing were incredibly powerful. The Nakajima Homer 21 18-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engines throwing out nearly 2,000 worth of horses. Now, what is interesting is you have the J5N1 here, and then also the J5N2. Now, from my research, only the J5N1 existed. Now, the only thing I can think of is, first of all, one thing is that there seems to be some Schrag music here. I cannot find any historical documents talking about the J5N1 having Schrag music, but the main differences that we see between the J5N2 and the N1 is this elongated cockpit and also the moving of either the aerial or the Schrag music itself. So the J5N2 is slightly different to the J5N1, but they're incredibly similar. If I was going to hazard a guess, because the main difference between the prototypes of the J5N series was that, the guns, pretty much. So my guess is that this will have different sets of guns to this one, but you know, I'm not hedging my bets here. In my opinion, this just doesn't exist. There is no historical data for this, so I'd rather just have a few versions of this one. The next vehicle that we're going to have to zoom out for and make sure that it is the next one. This is the J6K. Now it gets even more crazy, and you'll see why. Look at the amount of guns, and look at the weird pods that this machine has, or look at the wing roots that this thing has. Very, very interesting. So what is the J6K? The J6K was an interceptor built from the idea of the J3K and eventually becoming the J6K Jinpu, or the Squale. And what this was an interceptor fighter design which housed the Nakajima NK9A Homer 42 18-cylinder 2-row air-cooled radial piston engine. It was able to fire out 2,200 horsepower. You can see it has a 4-bladed prop on it, and it was cancelled in 1944. The original project started in 1940, and this just never really got off the ground. I'm guessing they just went to different areas. None were officially built. Obviously, there were some which were built partially. You can see one here, and also it had a main armament of two 13.2mm and two 30mm. But the problem with this is that armament does not match up to what we see here, right? In this, what we see is actually 4 guns on this one wing, and I'm guessing 4 on the other. Meaning that if we go here and actually have a look at this picture, which is another picture of a slightly different version of the same aircraft, you can tell by the wing and also the general shape of the fuselage and the tail, it does have some extra guns built into it, and maybe some bombs underneath, or something odd is going on here. So if I was going to hazard a guess, the J6K that was supposed to be built, it was supposed to have this armament and this engine. But because of this model here, we might get a slightly different variant of the J6K, which will have either more 20s or more 30s or something like that. It's hard to tell caliber from this, but they definitely look like 20mm guns. Anyway, it's another one of those very fast, very high, well, not high interceptors, but one of those very fast interceptors that the Japanese never got off the ground, unfortunately. The next one is the Ki 64. Now, this is another one which never got off the ground, but I'm happy that we do have a model of it because, well, it didn't get off the ground in a production way, but it was flight tested. This was actually built and tested, which is great to see. So there was one prototype which did fly, and it had 2 tandem engines. So this is similar to the VB1002 that we see from the French thing. So basically you have one drive shaft connected to the propeller, which is powered by two separate engines, and had a 3-blade contra rotating propeller, or contra prop. You can see it right here with the 6 blades overall. And the engine itself was called the HA201, and it was a collection of two HA40s, stuck together, and it had 2,350 horsepower. Now, this machine was either supposed to have 4 20mm, 2 20mm, and 2 12.7. So you would either have the 420s or the 220s and 212s. For me here, it looks like it's going to have the 2 20mm and the 212s, but it's kind of hard to say. On top of this, these guns were never mounted on this machine. This was seen as this is what we should do, instead of this is what we did do. It's an unarmed prototype at the end of the day, but it was flight tested, and on its 5th flight, just like a lot of these unfortunate tandem powered machines, it caught fire, and it was able to land, but it did have heavy damage to it, and the project itself in 1944 was abandoned. It seems like a lot of these projects were abandoned in 1944, which makes sense. You want to consolidate what you're trying to work on to make sure to defend the homeland, which is pretty much in 1944 where the war definitely starts turning against the Japanese. But the prototype itself did survive the war, so it isn't one of those ones which was destroyed, during the end of the war, which is great to hear. So we're probably going to have more flight statistics on it than other machines. I think it's a really cool aircraft, and I hope it does come to the game, even with a bit of fidgeting with the ammunition. The next one is perplexing once again. So we've already had a few machines which are a little bit odd. The Key 174 is also incredibly odd to me. And the reason for this is because the Key 174 is an experimental long-range reconnaissance bomber, a high-altitude operational bomber. Now, I understand the idea of adding these multi-purpose bombers in. I understand, if they could carry a decent bomb load, and this thing can, it could carry technically up to 1,000 kilos, so my guess is probably more about 800 or 500, and there were 16 of them built. They were tested, all over the place, which is great, and it had access to 2 Mitsubishi HA104 RU turbo supercharged 18-cylinder air-cooled radial pistol engines with about 2,000 horsepower each. So this was, a pretty beefy aircraft, let's say. And it also had a pressurized cabin because it was supposed to be used at high altitude. But the main purpose of this machine was for photo reconnaissance. And in-game, well, we don't have really photo reconnaissance. And another thing is when we look at the defensive armaments, because this thing was supposed to be a high altitude away from pretty much everything, it only has one 12.7mm as a defensive gun. That's it. So even though it has an okay bomb load, it's obviously fulfilled its job pretty well. The problem is, in War Thunder, all you have is that about 1,000 kilo bomb load where you have no defenses, but you have really powerful engines. So this thing would be quite quick. It would be quite nippy. It would be able to get to the target and back, but it wouldn't be able to defend itself, and the bomb load isn't too impressive. So for me, it would be a weird pick, right, to add to the game, because it wouldn't really have a place unless you really severely changed how either a reconnaissance mechanic works in aerialistic, or if it was just in crazy fast as BR and nothing would be able to catch it. It also had, this machine never saw operational service, even though it showed promise in what it was trying to do, which was of course photo reconnaissance. It was also fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks, some armor on the front, and a pressurized cabin for the crew of 5. So you needed 5 crew with 1 turret, mainly designed to take wonderful pictures. The Key 88 is the most perplexing out of all of these. Now, the Key 88 is a paper vehicle, basically. What I mean by this is a full prototype was never built, and also this is probably the one which has the least known about it. One of the interesting things that Gaijin has talked about is they want to get away from paper vehicles. Even in their latest Q&A, they talked about how with the Tiger II 105 and the Panther II, that they want to replace them once they have their replacements ready. Now, the Key 88 would be a step back in this idea of getting rid of paper vehicles, because it was never fully built. This is the only picture really that exists of it, and as you can see, it's not even finished with its airframe. And the Key 88, if you want a little bit of a backstory about it, it was a Japanese proposal for a design which was inspired by the P-39 Aerocobra of all things. It had mounted in it a 37mm and also two 20mm with a 1500 horsepower Kawasaki HA140 engine, but it just was never finished. It was never built as you would have wanted it to. So therefore, I find it very odd that if we're taking these as, vehicles that are going to come to the game, I find it very odd that this is one of the machines added in the list. Then we have some fully done up models, so instead of just, these ones which are kind of preliminary ones, well, I shouldn't say that. These are foundation models, meaning that this is what you build upon. They're generally fully completed when it comes to their, their general outlook, and then you've just got to add stuff to it, and then, of course, the flight model or the damage model itself. So this is the HAK1. This was the first prototype version of the H8 series of aircraft, the flying boats, and it mounted some slightly weaker engines to the one that we have in game, which is the HAK3, I believe, and also there was, depending on which prototype you want to pick, because there was 4 H8K1 prototypes overall, they all have slightly different engines. So depending on how powerful you want to make it, but it should be pretty much similar to the H8K3. Then we have the H8K4, and this was just a H8K3 which had better engines on it. It had the 1825 horsepower MK4T Mitsubishi Kasei 25B engines. So 2 were converted from the H8K3, so this would just be a faster version of it, so nothing that special. Then we get on to what everybody is talking about, the Vought F8 Crusader. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this because it seems like a lot of people are incredibly hyped about this, and I understand why, but I do need to reiterate, these are only models. These are not fully fledged in the game. We have no time period on this, and we have literally no idea if Gaijin is going to accept all of these vehicles, and on top of it, we don't know how far through production any of these machines are. So after getting that out there, let's talk about the Crusader. I keep wanting to call it the Corsair, but it's the Crusader. So it's as simple as this. It's a single-engine, supersonic, carrier-based air superiority jet. It mainly served in Vietnam, and it can go Mach 1.86. So this is a fast aircraft which has access to a lot of things. It has 4 hardpoints. It has 2 which are close to the side, which you can see here, and then 2 on the underwings. And the underwing hardpoints are designed to carry rockets. They're designed to carry bombs. And then the ones which are close to the cockpit itself are supposed to carry stuff like Sidewinders or Matra Magics. So overall, you have a multi-purpose machine in terms of War Thunder, but it is an air superiority jet. So this should do insanely well in the game. Right? Whenever you have a professional air superiority jet, they normally do great in air realistic. In ground realistic, it will probably be useless, but in every other, mode, when it comes to air superiority, it should do well, depending on what gets added alongside it as well. Because a lot of people are seeing it from the point of view that it gets added next update. I don't think that's the case personally. I would be incredibly surprised if that was the case, but, well, it would do well against the T2, I suppose. It does also have fire control radar, meaning that it has very similar radar to what you see on stuff like the T2, or at least that is my understanding. Remember, I'm not as well versed with jets as I am with propeller aircraft, but yeah, this is an aircraft which a lot of people are looking forward to in in the American tech tree, and I do want to at some point sit down with people and just have a chat, maybe even put it on the channel, about aircraft to look forward to for the Americans. But there isn't just one Crusader, there is two. This is the Crusader F8 EFN, and a lot of people are taking this as the F8E French Navy Crusader, which would make sense because the French Navy did have a Crusader that they used, and it was the F8E version. So what was the difference between this one and the normal F8 that we just looked at? Well, it had an improved engine in it. It also had an improved radar in a larger nose cone, and also it was able to contain the electronics required for the bullpup missile. So it should be able to carry the bullpups as well. It could carry 2 of them at a time, and also the payload increased to 5,000 pounds, probably because of the increase in engine. So this may be another one of those where other nations get better toys than the Americans actually have because, well, it was developed by other nations. Something that was interesting, I was talking to Rocker about this, and he explained it really well. So one of the fundamental questions I had is, why in-game do the majority of other nations have better sabers than America? And even in history, the Canadair Sabre or the F40, these were better, let's say, evolutions on American designs. And why was that the case? Why didn't America fully go into the Sabre idea? And it's as simple as this. While America was exporting sabers to other countries and letting them define them as they wanted, they were working on much larger projects at the time. So they were 5 steps, 10 steps ahead of everyone else. So in-game, think about it like this. While they were exporting sabers to other countries, they were working on the F100. Right? So they had a better thing going on for themselves, and instead of staying with the old tech, which would have been the Sabre, they were dealing with the new tech, which was the F100. The problem with this in-game is that it's not really represented because of the BR system. But if we ever got a historical matchmaking system, it would probably be absolute hell when we look at the late-tier jets. Anyway, moving on from this Crusader, we have a little plane, and this little plane, I can't remember its name, is the DI-6. So the DI-6 is a fighter, and it was also known as the TSKB-11, and it was predominantly a fighter, depending on the armament that you had. So if you wanted to make this a ground attacker, what you had to do is change out the guns. So if you wanted it to be a fighter, you would add in 3 7.62 Shikasses in the front. If you wanted it to be a ground attacker, then you would add in 4 PV-1s in the front of it. It also has, as you can see, a tail gunner right here, which is really cool, to be honest. And it had the standard Shvestov M25 radial engine with 700 horsepower. It could also carry some bombs, I believe 40 kilo bombs as well. And overall, it's just another one of those mid-1930s Soviet biplanes, which looks really cool, and hopefully eventually will make it to the game, kind of alongside some other weird and wonderful ground attackers that we have. The next one is another Soviet machine, which is armed to the teeth because it's one of these weird and wonderful prototype attackers / high altitude things that the Soviets really liked at the time. So this is it. This is the Soviet heavy fighter that we are having a look at, and as you can see, its name is the Polikarpov TRCMA Tizmar. I'm guessing is what it's supposed to be. Now, oh, come on, there we go. So this Soviet heavy fighter, there was 2 of them built in 1941. It was also flight tested in 1941, and it had access to 2 Mikulin AM-37 liquid-cooled V12s with 1,400 horsepower each, and it also had access to a plethora of guns. So 2 20s in the wing roots, then you got 2 12.7s, and then 4 7.62s in the nose, and 2 7.62 turrets in the booty. So you just have a ton of firepower, when it comes to this machine. The Soviets really liked this idea of a heavy fighter, which had a ton of guns on it. You can see that from like the Yak-2, the Yak-4, and the I-29. This would be a slightly earlier project, which will have morphed eventually into those ideas. This also morphed into the PE-2, if I'm not mistaken. Unfortunately, after Polikarpov died, the interest in designs like this kind of disappeared because they were just seen as redundant for what the Soviets generally needed for the war effort. Then you have a post-war idea from the Soviets, the IL-20, the definite ugly duckling. Now, the IL-20 is known for many factors, two which are very interesting, at least to me. I've covered it in a previous video, but I'll cover it again here. So, the first thing is that it has adjustable offensive armament. It has 4 23mm, which are sat in the wings, which you can see here, but look how they're tilted down in this model. That's because if you wanted to, while you were going, you could adjust the mounts of the 423s and actually depress them up to 23 degrees. This revolutionary idea was there so if you wanted to strafe ground targets or go after them, you would not have to nose down to have a look at them. Instead, you could go over them and shoot downwards at that degree. Kind of like the same idea behind the MiG-15 Bish with the rockets which are angled downwards. It's exactly the same with these 23s, and I think it's just a really cool idea. This machine was actually slower and less powered engine-wise than the IL-10, which came before it. It had an AM-47 liquid-cooled V12 3000 horsepower engine, and also it had a 23mm turret in the back. So when it comes to actual offensive and defensive armament, it's pretty good. It also had extra armor on the front, because obviously you would be ground attacking. It could carry bombs if required as well, but there was only one prototype of this built. On top of this, a problem that you can already see, even though the engine itself was underpowered, meaning that it would have been tough to fly, let's say. Also, the adjustable guns is a really interesting idea in theory, but obviously could become an issue. Then the general fact that these types of aircraft at the time the IL-20 was built, post-war, were kind of going out of fashion, if we're quite honest, in favor of multi-purpose aircraft. The fact that the cockpit was so close to the nose, if you needed to bail from the cockpits, it would be very dangerous to do that. So you were basically hoping for air superiority and nothing shooting at you, and on top of this, nothing going wrong with your aircraft. Otherwise, you may have a few issues with being able to survive. The next vehicle on the chopping block is the what's this one? I can't remember. It's the YA, is it? It is the Yak, sorry. It's the Yak-25. I should really learn Cyrillic. So, the Yak-25, if we have a look here, is a swept-wing turbojet-powered interceptor and reconnaissance aircraft. The first production version was called the Yak-25, which I'm guessing is the one that is being referenced, and it had access to the Izumrud radar with 2 37mm, and also had access to the turbojets, which were Makuling AM-5s. There was over 200 of these produced, so it's kind of a surprise that we haven't got this one in-game already, and to be honest, it would be absolutely lovely to see, just because it is one of those very iconic Soviet aircrafts, which looks really, really nice. So hopefully, in the near future, this one does get added to the game. You can see the you can see the guns sat down here, and there also seems to be some kind of rocket pod maybe here, but that may just be me obfuscating what's going on. Now, the next one is the Soviet Meteor, is the best way of putting it. This is the Alexeyev I-215. The Soviets made a copy of the Meteor. I think it's probably the generous way of putting it, and here is the picture of it. And in 1947, 2 prototypes were constructed with the designation of I-211. These were converted into the I-215s when they upgraded the engines to Tumansky RD-20s, and they also added 2 23mm to the overall armament of this machine. Now, the problem that this machine had was that the Soviets preferred the more swept-wing design of the MiG-15, therefore this idea never really got off the ground, apart from in the prototype form. It definitely showed that they could do it, though. It definitely showed that they were able to make a vehicle very similar to the Meteor, but instead they preferred the MiG-15 series, which I don't really blame them for. This one is another one of those twin-engine heavy fighters, which started off from one idea and was bred into another one. So this is the Petlyakov VI-100. And what you find from this machine is that it started life as a high-altitude interceptor, and then it was changed from that idea into a fighter/dive bomber from 1938. So once again, we have an early war twin-engine machine from the Soviets, which they're trying to make work. And this was all metal. It was aerodynamically clean, it was a monoplane, it had turbo-supercharged engines, it had a lot going for it, and also it had access to some very odd armaments. They actually wanted to put a 3-inch gun on it when they first were initially planning out what they wanted to do for the armament, but instead they settled for a 2 20mm, 2 7.62 load, and then a 7.62 turret in the back. This thing could also carry bombs, since of course it was a dive bomber by the end of the day, and once again, this was one of those designs which eventually morphed into the Peshka, or the PE-2, that we know in games so well. So even though this thing never really saw the light of day, and it didn't really get past prototype, just understand that a lot of the ideas that come from these twin-engine fighters do make their way onto the battlefield in the form of other planes. The next one is this little baby. So this is the Neyman R-10. Now, the Neyman R-10 is one of those light bombers, I suppose you'd class it as. It looks very reminiscent of like the Su-2 that we have in game already, and it was a reconnaissance and light bomber. It had access to 2 7.62s looking forward, and then it had a ball turret I should say a top ball turret with a 7.62mm Shikas in it, and it had access to the Svetstov M25, so a very similar engine that we found on the biplane, meaning that it was quite slow, but it was, well worth it. It had access to 50 kilo bombs, and it should have done pretty well for itself. It would just be a low-tier light bomber for the Soviets, and we already have a bunch of them, but it still should be represented. It was still built. And then the next plane is the Tu-12. Now, the Tu-12 was a evolution of the Tu-2 series of aircraft. It was designed to actually replace the medium bomber, but what it turned out to be instead was a kind of testbed for many different ideas. So the experimental part of it was obviously the engines, the speed, and also the guns which were involved. So what they found from this is the offensive 23mm, which was mounted in the nose, was a good idea, right? They liked that idea. But they also found that they didn't like having turrets which only had 2 12.7mm in them. So this machine here, with the 2 12.7s, they decided instead of that, they were always going to go for 20mm or higher when it came to the defensive guns. So basically, you can thank this plane here, where I believe there was about 6 of them built, the Tu-12, for having those ridiculous turrets when it comes to stuff like the IL-28 and the Tu-14T and all of that. On top of this as well, after its testing, it was used as a trainer, which is, great. It should be, useful for people to train on. But the major issue this machine had was at the high speeds, which of course the point of a jet bomber is to get up to those high speeds. It was uncontrollable. It was nearly impossible to even steer this thing at high speeds. So luckily it wasn't put into full mass production, otherwise we may have had a hell of a lot more issues on our hands and a lot of people dying. Then we have a World War II reconnaissance plane. We have the MBR2 in the game, so why not stick in this machine here, which is, of course, the MDR6. So the MBR2, if you don't know what it is, it's a rare vehicle that we have in War Thunder right now. It has a single mounted engine, and it has turrets very similar to this one. The MDR6 is a much larger machine, but it was still used for the same purpose, reconnaissance flying boats. It had two Shvetsov M63 radial piston engines with 1100 horsepower each. It had a 7.62 bow turret and a 12.7 dorsal turret, and if it required as well, it obviously could carry 1,000 kilos worth of bombs, which would definitely slow it down quite a lot. But adding this to the game, I think would definitely be worth it. It's pretty much just another flying boat which has a decent bomb load, and at lower tiers would fit pretty well, and it could also defend itself. So there is a ton of interesting ideas which all came from a supposed leak, or somebody not thinking about what to actually put up from the PSY06 guys, and it's just great to see. And one thing I will say is, if you Gaijin work with many different modelers, right? I don't think publicly they talk about who they actually work with, but just have a look around the internet and have a look for sites like these, and there are plenty of them around. I don't really want to talk about many of them which are not, like, the public generally doesn't know about, because obviously, there are emails here, and there are ways that creators could get bombarded when all they want to do is work. Maybe it's good for the publicity, who knows, but unless something becomes publicly known, I'm not really going to fully talk about it. It's kind of like how there is out there a fully HD version of some Lancaster turrets, and they were made specifically for, well, let's just say specific reasons, and it would be nice if in the future we see stuff like that in game. But all I'm saying is there's more places like this out there. You've just got to find them. Anyway, thank you to Hunter, Tan, and also Kiosaloft. Thank you to Pytel, Rocker, and Nova for, telling me about this in the first place. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank B. Young, Blackie, Daniel Stanton, Dyslexic Child, Martinez, Matati, Moxie, Nito, Nick Graham, Alobralo, and Super Cacti for supporting me on Patreon.